What if his silence isn't strength, but a mask for his deepest fears? And what if the void he creates with his absence says more about his inner chaos than about your worth? There's a moment, quiet, unbearable, when a woman begins to question herself in the face of a man's withdrawal. The messages stop, the energy shifts, the warmth fades into a cold neutrality. He's still there, maybe in body, maybe not, but emotionally, he's left the room. And in that absence, the mind begins its ritual, replaying conversations, analyzing tones, wondering, did I say too much? Not enough? But here's a truth you deserve to hold firmly. The silence of a man is not always a sign of power. Often, it's a fragile defense, a performance. A man who ignores you is not necessarily detached. He may be drowning in an emotional ocean he was never taught to navigate. Let's pause here before we explore the architecture of this silence. Because if you felt the sting of emotional abandonment, you need more than intellectual insight. You need emotional validation. There's a particular kind of ache that forms when someone becomes unavailable, not with a dramatic exit, but with a slow, quiet fading. It's an invisible kind of rejection, one that doesn't scream, but whispers doubts into your psyche. You begin to wonder if your needs are too loud, if your presence is too much, if your love is too inconvenient. But this is not about you being too much. This is about someone else being emotionally unequipped. In psychological terms, ignoring can be a form of passive withdrawal, often used as a defense mechanism. It isn't conscious cruelty. It's not necessarily malice. It's more primitive than that. A conditioned response born from emotional discomfort. Think of the way a child covers their eyes when afraid. The fear doesn't disappear, but the illusion of invisibility gives temporary relief. Adult silence can be a sophisticated version of this. If I don't talk about it, if I disengage, it won't hurt. Freud might have called this a conflict of the ego. The man who ignores is not merely rejecting the woman before him. He may be rejecting his own vulnerability. His silence is the result of a war between his desire for connection and his fear of exposure. He wants closeness, but doesn't know how to surrender to it without feeling overwhelmed or threatened. In this space of avoidance, a myth forms that he is strong, unaffected, in control. But emotional strength isn't measured by how well someone can withdraw. It's measured by how honestly they can engage. Let me offer you a brief symbolic story. There was once a woman named Lucia. She met a man who spoke in sparks, vivid, intense, promising connection. But after each encounter, he would vanish into silence. No explanation, no rupture, just absence. Lucia, wise but wounded, began to shrink. She quieted her needs, fearing she was pushing him away. She waited in the silence, confusing patience with love. One day she realized the silence was not her test, but his pattern, that his inability to stay wasn't about her depth, but about his fear of drowning in it. He had built a fragile self upon the avoidance of emotional labor, and the moment she stopped translating his silence as mystery and started seeing it as fear, she was free. Freud, in his study of the human psyche, would interpret such behavior as repression, the ignored conversation, the unspoken feeling, all pushed into the unconscious, where it brews and leaks out in behaviors like ghosting, withdrawal, or avoidance. Silence becomes not a pause but a prison, a way of not feeling, not confronting, not choosing. So the next time you're met with silence, ask yourself, is he truly indifferent or deeply avoidant? Is this an act of strength or the symptom of emotional immaturity? When a man cannot face emotional connection, he will mask it with distance. When he cannot manage discomfort, he will create confusion. When he is afraid of being seen, he will disappear. And when this happens, your healing begins not in decoding his silence, but in refusing to internalize it. Because your worth is not up for interpretation in someone else's emotional absence. So here is a simple but powerful act of defiance. Write a letter you will never send. Not to change him, not to beg or explain, but to give your pain a voice. Tell the silence what it cost you. Then choose to stop listening to it, because silence is also a response, and sometimes your greatest healing. There is a dangerous illusion embedded in the silence of a man who withdraws, the illusion of control. To the outside world, it may look like composure, like restraint, as if his ability to say nothing is proof of maturity. But under the surface, silence often conceals not discipline, but disarray. Not serenity, but fear. What if ignoring isn't a form of power, but a reflex of emotional paralysis? What if the man who chooses not to speak is not above the emotion, but beneath it, unable to hold it? Let's speak honestly. When someone refuses to engage, when they go quiet in the middle of emotional tension, they are not always practicing self-regulation. Sometimes they are practicing avoidance, and that avoidance is not a strategy, it's a symptom. This behavior, from a behavioral science perspective, functions as negative reinforcement. By withdrawing from a difficult emotional moment, the person feels immediate relief. The discomfort of the conversation disappears, the confrontation fades, and over time silence becomes a habit, a learned coping mechanism rewarded by the reduction of inner tension. But this relief is deceptive, because while he avoids the discomfort of the present moment, he also avoids the possibility of repair, of intimacy, of growth. Silence creates space, but not always the kind that heals. Sometimes it creates a void where connection should live. You may have already felt the sting of this dynamic. A man grows distant, doesn't return messages, changes the subject when feelings arise. You try to stay calm, to give space, believing that maybe he just needs time. But days pass. You're left navigating an emotional maze with no map, interpreting his absence, overthinking your actions, measuring your value in the crumbs of communication he occasionally throws. And slowly, something begins to erode in you. Not just your patience, but your sense of clarity. This is what emotional ambiguity does. It destabilizes you. You begin to believe his silence is a judgment, that it's evidence you were wrong to express your feelings, to want more, to need him. You mistake his withdrawal as a mirror of your flaws, but what if I told you his silence isn't about you at all? What if it's about him, his inability to regulate his own emotional states, his fear of confrontation, his unconscious reliance on avoidance as a way to maintain the appearance of control? Freud would interpret this through the lens of defense mechanisms, in particular denial and projection. Denial, refusing to acknowledge the emotional reality of the situation. Projection, attributing discomfort or conflict to you, rather than confronting his own emotional limitations. In this dynamic, silence becomes his shield. It spares him from exposure, from having to show vulnerability, admit confusion, reveal need. This is not conscious manipulation, it is more primitive than that, an automatic, conditioned defense, like a muscle reflex when something is too hot. Emotional closeness is the flame, and silence is the flinch. He may even believe he is acting wisely, that by staying silent he is keeping the peace, but the peace he preserves is external. The war still rages inside, and in protecting himself from the discomfort of dialogue, he unknowingly sabotages the intimacy he may deeply crave. Here's the paradox. Silence gives the illusion of control, but it actually signifies emotional disconnection from the self. The man who cannot speak about his feelings is not free from them. He is enslaved by them. And that enslavement will quietly rot the foundations of any relationship he builds. This brings us to a painful truth for many women. You cannot teach someone to face what they are committed to avoiding. If his silence protects him from inner pain, no amount of your patience, softness, or strength will substitute the inner work he refuses to do. So what can you do? Begin by refusing to romanticize the silence. Don't call it mystery. Don't label it depth. Don't tell yourself he's just different or needs space, when what you're witnessing is a pattern of avoidance. There's a difference between temporary withdrawal to self-regulate and habitual emotional abandonment. Second, practice presence with yourself. Instead of chasing after answers he won't give, return to the one place you do have power, your own internal dialogue. What are you telling yourself when he goes silent? What old fears does it awaken? What patterns are being reactivated? Let me offer a question for reflection. Am I waiting for someone to speak, so I don't have to listen to myself? And here's a practice, simple but symbolic. Each time you feel ignored, name it out loud, not to him, but to yourself. Say, "This is emotional withdrawal. I see it. I will not make it my responsibility." Because silence is not neutral. It is communication by omission, and it has the power to shape your self-worth unless you actively resist internalizing it. The illusion of control may comfort him, but it does not have to control you. To understand a man's silence is not to excuse it, but to see it for what it truly is, a defense rooted in the architecture of his psyche. Not every silence comes from strength. Sometimes it comes from a battle between conflicting internal forces, between desire and fear, closeness and control, love and self-preservation. Freud believed that behavior is rarely random. What we do, or refuse to do, is often the result of unconscious processes we neither recognize nor question. So when a man ignores you, when he chooses absence over engagement, Freud would ask not only what he is avoiding, but what pain that avoidance is protecting him from. Let's begin with the ego's struggle. The ego stands between the impulsive demands of the id, our raw emotional desires, and the moral, restrictive pressures of the superego, the internalized voice of societal and parental expectations. When a man feels emotionally overwhelmed, especially in the presence of intimacy, the ego scrambles for balance. But if his emotional literacy is limited, if he never learned to hold discomfort or articulate needs, then silence becomes his escape. A silent man is often a man in psychic conflict, choosing inaction because action would risk exposure. Repression plays a central role in this silence. Instead of expressing anger, sadness, fear, he buries it. Not because he is stoic, but because he is afraid of the consequences of feeling too much. This is especially true in men raised in environments where vulnerability was punished or mocked, when tears were weakness, when tenderness was unsafe. Over time, they repress not just emotions, but the entire need for emotional connection. And repression doesn't make the feeling disappear. It makes it mutate into detachment, irritability, control, or ghosting. But repression rarely stays quiet. What is buried returns, often in indirect, passive-aggressive forms, like ignoring texts, changing the subject, withdrawing sexually or emotionally, not because he doesn't care, but because he cares more than he can handle. Then there is denial, another classic Freudian mechanism. He tells himself he's just busy or not good at talking or doesn't want to argue. These justifications are not lies, they are protective fantasies. To admit the real reason, that he is emotionally paralyzed, would shatter the self-image he spent years trying to maintain. But perhaps the most illuminating lens Freud offers us is transference. This is the phenomenon where past emotional experiences are unconsciously projected onto present relationships. A man who ignores you during conflict may not be reacting to you at all. He may be reacting to a memory, to an earlier relationship where expressing himself led to pain, abandonment, or shame. In this way, you become the stand-in for someone else, and his silence becomes a reenactment, not a response. Finally, let us touch on one of Freud's darker but profound insights: the death drive, the unconscious pull towards self-sabotage and destruction. While we are wired for connection, some individuals are also driven by an inner impulse to dismantle what's good, not out of malice but because peace feels unfamiliar. For those who've only known love as chaos or scarcity, real intimacy can feel threatening, and so they destroy it, not with overt violence, but with passive neglect, with silence. Freud would not say this to justify the pain a woman feels. He would say it to clarify the system behind it, because when you realize that a man's silence is not a mystery to decode, but a repetition of his own unhealed history, you stop blaming yourself, and you stop trying to fix what he is unconsciously committed to repeating. A symbolic image. Imagine a man as a house. From the outside it looks solid, quiet, still, but inside the wiring is tangled, the foundation cracked. When you knock, he doesn't answer. Not because he didn't hear you, but because he doesn't know how to open the door without letting everything collapse. So here's a call to consciousness. Are you loving a man, or loving the part of you that hopes your love will heal what he refuses to face? And here is your simple act. Stop asking, why is he ignoring me? And begin asking, what has he silenced in himself? And why am I trying to carry that silence for him? Because a woman does not have to become fluent in someone else's emotional dysfunction to prove her loyalty. And you are not responsible for translating a silence that was never yours to begin with. A man's silence is not just absence. It's a presence that haunts. It speaks in unfinished sentences, in the void between messages, in the way your mind begins to rehearse apologies you never needed to make. The emotional ambiguity it creates is not neutral. It is active, shaping your behavior, thoughts, and self-worth in ways that are as corrosive as they are quiet. Have you ever found yourself whispering, "Maybe he just needs space," while your heart is shouting for clarity? Have you stayed, not because it felt good, but because leaving without closure felt worse? This is the psychological cost of being ignored, and it is women, emotionally open, relationally attuned, who often carry the weight of it most. Internalizing blame is the first wound. When a man pulls away without explanation, the emotional void demands an answer. And when none is given, the mind turns inward. You search for the flaw. You ask, "What did I do? Did I come on too strong? Was I too emotional? Not enough?" This is not vanity. This is conditioning. From early girlhood, many women are taught to maintain connection at all costs, to be the emotional caretakers of relationships, to soothe, to mend, to accommodate. When that connection is threatened by silence, you instinctively ask how you failed. But this isn't about failure, it's about conditioning. Behavioral science shows that inconsistent reinforcement, where affection is given and taken away unpredictably, creates the strongest emotional bonds. Like a gambler at a slot machine, you keep showing up, hoping that this time you'll get a response. This time he'll open up. This time he'll explain. And when he doesn't, the silence deepens, and so does your investment. You're not crazy. You're caught in a psychological loop. Freud might suggest that this moment activates something even deeper, not just adult longing, but childhood scripts. The silent man may unconsciously remind you of another figure who withheld, a parent, a caregiver, someone whose love you learned to earn through compliance. In that sense, his silence is not just his. It becomes symbolic, a mirror of all the unmet needs you were taught to silence in yourself. And so you bend, you become quieter, more careful, hoping your restraint will be rewarded with his return. But instead, what begins to erode is your self-worth. When communication is uncertain, your confidence becomes conditional. You begin to doubt your perceptions, your value, even your emotional instincts. Emotional ambiguity is like walking on glass. No matter how gently you step, you still bleed. Over time, the silence is no longer just his. It becomes internalized. You stop asking for clarity, you silence yourself. This is where the cycle must be broken, not by making him speak, but by choosing to no longer shrink in his absence. Breaking the cycle starts with recognizing the pattern. You cannot force someone to show up emotionally, but you can stop auditioning for their attention. Emotional maturity requires presence. Silence may be a phase, but if it's a pattern, it's a form of abandonment. And abandonment, when tolerated too long, becomes self-abandonment. So what does it look like to reclaim your voice within the silence? You begin with one internal decision. I will no longer make myself smaller to be tolerated by someone who cannot face me. Freud would ask you to consider the unconscious loyalty you might be holding, to pain, to old dynamics, to the hope that this time someone will stay. But healing begins when you break that loyalty, when you choose clarity over confusion, peace over potential, reality over romanticizing. A woman cannot build her strength in the fog of another's avoidance. So here is your practice. Each time you feel the urge to explain yourself to someone who is ignoring you, pause. Write down what you would have said, but instead of sending it, read it back to yourself. Validate your own clarity. See your own effort. Then ask, does this person deserve the truth I am offering if they continue to offer me silence? Because love is not earned in whispers, and your voice was never meant to echo in an empty room. There comes a moment, not dramatic, not loud, when a woman simply exhales and decides, I'm done carrying what was never mine. No more decoding silences, no more shrinking to fit someone's emotional limits, no more mistaking ambiguity for depth. This is the quiet birth of power. Not the kind that needs revenge or explanation, but the kind that comes from detachment, from understanding deeply and without bitterness that someone else's inability to engage is not your failure, it's their unfinished work. So how do you move from pain to power? How do you transform the hollow ache left by emotional neglect into the steady rhythm of self-respect? It begins with boundaries. A boundary is not a wall, it's a declaration. A line drawn in the sand of your nervous system that says, my peace is no longer negotiable. When a man ignores you, especially repeatedly, It is not your job to restore the connection. Your responsibility is to protect your inner clarity, to name what is happening and respond accordingly. This might mean silence in return, not as punishment, but as preservation. You are not mirroring him out of spite. You are disengaging from a dynamic that drains you. Because every time you tolerate emotional neglect, you reinforce the belief that your presence can be taken for granted. Behavioral science teaches us that behavior that is not reinforced eventually extinguishes. That means when you stop rewarding the behavior, when you stop chasing, apologizing, or performing, it loses its power over you, not because it changes him, but because it reclaims you. Next comes self-awareness. You cannot set strong boundaries without understanding your own triggers. So ask yourself, why does his silence feel familiar? What part of me is activated by being ignored? Often, the pain we feel in the present is amplified by pain we never resolved from the past. When you can name those old wounds, the child who wasn't heard, the teenager who was overlooked, the woman who kept proving her worth, you can stop reenacting them. Awareness breaks repetition. Then, in the sacred space left behind by the silence, you are invited to discover something radical. Solitude is not punishment. It is sanctuary. The woman who once feared being alone, who once saw herself only through the eyes of the one who ignored her, now finds comfort in her own company. She writes again. She eats slowly. She breathes without checking her phone. She walks without hoping someone is watching. In solitude, she remembers who she is beneath the ache. And from that place, her boundaries are no longer defenses. They are expressions of self-knowledge. Detachment is the final key, not coldness, not apathy, but the wisdom of choosing not to invest your emotions where they are not held with care. You stop needing closure. You stop needing to be understood. You stop needing a response to validate what you already know. That being ignored by someone emotionally unavailable does not mean you are unworthy. It means they are unequipped. It means they cannot meet you. And it means you are being invited to meet yourself fully without apology. So here is your symbolic task, simple but powerful. Write a sentence. One sentence. Start with, I release the need for, let whatever comes out, come out. I release the need for his validation. I release the need to fix what's broken in him. I release the need to be chosen by someone who won't choose himself. Because the moment you release that need, you become whole again. Not because he changed, but because you did. And from this place, at this grounded, sacred autonomy, you begin to write a new story. One where you don't wait for someone to value you. One where you choose to be free, even if it means being misunderstood. One where silence no longer unsettles you because you've made peace with your own voice. There is a kind of silence that wounds, and a kind that heals. The first leaves you questioning your worth, your words, your very instincts. The second arises when you finally stop waiting to be seen by someone who chooses not to look. When a man ignores you, the natural response, especially for women raised to connect, to empathize, to repair, is to fill the void, to explain, to soften, to reach across the emotional gap and offer grace where none was given. But at some point, often after one silent disappointment too many, you begin to realize this silence is not a pause. It is a pattern, and no amount of compassion can substitute for someone else's emotional responsibility. In this script, we've explored the psychological roots of male silence, not to excuse it, but to expose its function. What looks like indifference may actually be avoidance. What feels like rejection may stem from his inner chaos. Freud's interpretation reveals not power, but a fractured ego at war with vulnerability, operating from repression, transference, and denial. But what matters most is what his silence awakens in you. Does it awaken old wounds of being unseen? Does it seduce you into self-blame, into emotional labor you were never meant to carry? Or does it finally push you to stop translating the behavior of others as a reflection of your worth? Because a woman's power begins where emotional ambiguity ends. When you stop seeking clarity from someone committed to confusion, you make room for something else, your own knowing, your own voice, your own boundaries. What you've learned is not just the psychology of silence, but the spiritual intelligence of letting go, of recognizing that love without communication is not love. It's projection. that emotional absence is a form of abandonment, that you deserve presence, clarity, reciprocity, and most of all, peace. So let us close with this invitation. If you've ever been ignored and blamed yourself, if you've ever twisted your truth to keep someone close, if you've ever called silence strength to avoid feeling the sting of indifference, write this down and keep it somewhere visible. His silence is not my mirror, it is his limitation. You are not difficult, you just stopped settling for less. And now, it's your turn. Share your experience in the comments. What has silence taught you about your boundaries, your voice, your power? And if this resonated, subscribe for deeper explorations into self-worth, emotional resilience, and the psychological clarity you deserve. Because silence can break you, or it can awaken you. And a woman awakened is a woman who answers to no one's absence.